you've shared inside the book that there's four categories of things that when they go haywire, they can cause harm to the brain. We've touched on them kind of high level, but in the context of this woman that you just shared, can you help us understand how changing her diet made a difference in each one of these categories you highlighted earlier? So that was nutritional deficiencies, inflammation, oxidative stress, and insulin resistance. How did going on a ketogenic diet address all of those? If you could just talk top line.
Sure. So we'll start with nutrient deficiencies because one of the things that a lot of people don't realize about nutrient deficiencies is that even if you're eating a very nutritious diet, you can still have nutrient deficiencies because you may be eating some foods which interfere with your ability to absorb and utilize those nutrients, or those nutrients may not be in the proper form, kind of a human user-friendly form, right? And so depending on the foods you're eating, you may be absorbing and utilizing more or less of those nutrients. So that's one issue we can come back to is the quality of the foods you're eating, even if they contain nutrients, doesn't necessarily mean that you can access them. So that's one issue. And with this particular woman, we actually needed to make some changes to the composition of her ketogenic diet because she wasn't eating enough animal protein. So for example, her iron levels were running low. So so we needed to make some adjustments there and also take some of the foods out of her diet that were interfering with her ability to absorb iron. So we made some changes there. But even just switching from a primarily carbohydrate-based diet to a primarily fat-based diet, which is a ketogenic diet. In a ketogenic diet, most of your calories are coming from fat, and followed by protein, followed by carbohydrate, which is a very, very small amount of carbohydrate in a ketogenic diet. High fat, moderate protein, low carbohydrate. When you're eating a carbohydrate-based diet, such as is recommended by the USDA or the Mediterranean diet, where 40 to 65% of your calories are coming from carbohydrates, you need a different quantity of nutrients in order for your cells to process all that carbohydrate. So burning glucose for energy requires, for example, more magnesium. That's just one example of how the way that you eat affects your nutrient status. So if you're eating a high carbohydrate diet, you'll need more magnesium. When you eat a low carbohydrate diet, you need less magnesium. So that's just an interesting fact. So in any case, a ketogenic diet in and of itself is a diet that kind of spares your body, sort of can protect your body against certain nutrient deficiencies by reducing the amount, by making your cells more efficient at producing energy using fewer nutrients. So it reduces the demand for certain nutrients. I guess I'll put it that way. Now, that's nutrient deficiencies. When it comes to inflammation, ketogenic diets are really wonderful at reducing inflammation. A lot of that inflammation comes from high glucose levels. And for example, if you're eating a very starchy or sweet meal or snack or beverage, then you're going to get this glucose spike right after your meal that's exaggerated. And every time that happens, when you get a glucose spike in your bloodstream, you're also getting a glucose spike in your brain. And so the brain glucose mirrors the blood glucose level. The higher the blood glucose, the higher the brain glucose. They're not equivalent, but they mirror each other, right? So they're proportional. So blood sugar spike, brain sugar spike. Now, what happens when you get excess sugar in your brain is that excess sugar literally sticks. It sticks to proteins and lipids, the fats in the brain that your membranes are made of, DNA. It sticks to all the important molecules and structures in your brain and turns these molecules into these kind of sticky, dysfunctional, crippled, kind of caramelized clusters called advanced glycation end products, or AGEs. And they're called AGEs. It's an appropriate acronym because they're also one of the main factors in premature brain aging and in premature aging of the rest of the body as well, these AGEs. So AGEs are advanced glycation end products. Glycation means sugary, right? So So you've got too much sugar in the brain, you've got these dysfunctional molecules, and then, but the brain doesn't take this lying down. I mean, if these were allowed to accumulate, left to their own devices, they would eventually gum up the work, so to speak. The brain is not going to function properly. The cells aren't going to be able to communicate with each other well. So the brain has an immune system, and the immune system responds by saying, okay, we've got this emergency. Let's sound the alarm. We're going to now deliberately create inflammation and oxidative stress, which means we're going to release inflammatory cytokines, these little SOS molecules that create inflammation. And we're going to deliberately create oxidative stress, free radicals, reactive oxygen species, free radicals, to sound the alarm so that we can clear away these caramelized clusters. And that's all well and good. But then a period of healing is supposed to take place. The brain is supposed to return, the immune system is supposed to return the peace to the village, shall we say, right? Everything's supposed to go back to normal. But that's not what's happening. If you're eating refined carbohydrates 3, 4, 5, 6 times a day, the brain never gets a chance. I mean, the healing never gets a chance to take place. So instead of this temporary, controlled, targeted, healthy, functional inflammation and oxidative stress, which is a normal part of your immune reaction, you've got chronic, uncontrolled inflammation and oxidative stress, which is very damaging to the brain and destabilizes neurotransmitter activity as well. And so now you've got all kinds of problems, not just physical damage, but also chemical imbalances. And so when you go on a ketogenic diet, the ketogenic diet very reliably lowers and stabilizes blood sugar. So that also means it very reliably lowers and stabilizes brain sugar. And that's really, really important. So you've reduced inflammation, you've reduced oxidative stress, and you've improved your ability to use nutrients more efficiently. The other thing, and this is really the secret weapon of the ketogenic diet, is that it reliably lowers insulin levels as well. Not just blood sugar, which you can do with kind of a relaxed, low carb diet that will lower your blood sugar. But to lower your insulin levels, you have to actually not just keep an eye on your carbohydrates, but you have to just keep an eye in general on everything you're eating and how often, how much, and how often. And so when you do a properly formulated ketogenic diet, you're also lowering your insulin levels. And when you lower your insulin levels, you take all that pressure off of that delicate insulin signaling system, which is creating all that insulin resistance, which is making it hard for insulin to cross into the brain, where it is needed for the brain to turn glucose into energy. So if you have insulin resistance, what's happening is you've got glucose waltzing into the brain, no questions asked, but you've got insulin having a harder and harder time getting in. And therefore, your brain can be swimming in a sea of glucose and still be starving to death. That's exactly how we, lay the groundwork for Alzheimer's disease, for example. So when you go on a ketogenic diet, you reduce your risk for all of the diseases that insulin resistance can lead to, including sort of sputtering brain energy and sort of slowly dying brain tissue. But you also, when you go on a ketogenic diet, you stabilize your brain chemistry and you produce ketones. You're burning fat. The fat breaks down into ketones, these little bite-sized fragments of fat that can cross easily into the brain, and the brain can burn those for energy, and that bridges that energy gap. So if you have sluggish brain glucose processing from years of insulin resistance, which now, again, most of us have, then now you've got this supplemental fuel source, ketogenic diet, ketones coming to the rescue, bridging that energy gap so that some of those areas in your brain that are still kind of sputtering along, they can come back online. So it really does, it's a multi-purpose tool that addresses many different underlying causes of mental health problems in one single intervention.
So a couple questions that I have about the ketogenic diet, who can do it, who could be a good candidate for it, and whether or not it's therapeutic or people are on it long term. But really quickly, just because you mentioned insulin, most of our audience knows and is familiar that there are continuous glucose monitors that are available that look at glucose. And there's a lot of great companies out there. I'm an investor in a company called Levels that I'm a big fan of that I've shared with my audience. There's no continuous insulin monitors that we have right now. Unfortunately, maybe one day that will come. So most people who listen to our podcast know and have heard multitude of experts say it's important as part of your regular blood work that you start making sure that your doctor is looking at your fasting insulin, right? Do you agree with that? And generally, where do you want the numbers to be? Where do you want the fasting insulin to be as a marker of knowing that we are headed in the right direction or that we're maintaining a good sort of balance inside of our body?
I want your fasting insulin to be in the single digits. Ideally 6 or below is really nice, but single digits. And that's not true for most people. So when I worked in college campuses for many years, tested lots of fasting insulin levels, 20s, 30s, 40s. These are, young people, 18 to 22. Some of them look on the outside to be healthy, so to speak. They're not overweight. They don't have high blood sugar. They don't have diabetes. They don't have fatty liver. They have insulin resistance. They have high insulin levels. And so I want your fasting insulin to be in the single digits.
And so just a quick question about that. My fasting insulin typically is around, before I got serious about strength training, where I turned 40 and I said, okay, I'm completely under muscled because I grew up vegetarian, not eating enough protein, and in that sort of phenotype of the skinny fat Indian, right? Like not eating a lot of carbohydrates, eating a lot of vegetarian food, which was Taco Bell and anything that just didn't include meat. So ginger ale and 7-Up and other stuff because it just didn't have meat in it. And then I've shared this story before with my audience, but it's always worth sharing. And then as I started to go down the world and become more familiar with integrative and functional medicine and other doctors that were there, a friend of mine said, you've been vegetarian for a while and you've mentioned you were doing good. Like when you went vegan and you removed a lot of the processed foods out of your diet, which I ultimately did, you sort of felt like, oh, you had a lot more energy and your skin cleared up. And then that worked for about 6-7 years. And all of a sudden I felt like my brain wasn't working as much. He said, you should do an omega quant test. There's this new test that's out. It's omega quant. It's a little prick test. I have no affiliation with the company. And I did it. And I saw that my omega 3s were just super, super, super low. And my ratio of my omega index was way off. And I started including fish into my diet. And I felt like my brain turned on for the first time, right? I had that sort of firsthand experience of wow, okay, my brain is back to where its potential could be. And that was in my mid 20s. But nonetheless, what I was sharing with you is that when I got serious about strength training prior to that process, my insulin was maybe around 5, 6. Then I got serious about strength training. I even started including a few more carbohydrates in my diet, like white rice and other things, which I saw improved my performance in the gym. And because I added about almost 9-10 pounds of lean muscle mass, I actually saw that even though I was eating a little bit more carbohydrates, my insulin on average dropped down now to the high 2s or 3s, right? So do you have any commentary or thoughts on this and the intersection of, I think food is so important, but I think also muscle health and working out and being active and not having a sedentary lifestyle is important. Have you seen this in your clinical experience?
Absolutely. So, I'm going to steal this line from a clinician who took my training course and said this. So I don't remember who it was, but when it comes to healthy metabolism, diet is king and exercise is queen. And you can't run your metabolic kingdom without both of them. So you can't, just as you can't outrun a diet, you can't sort of you can't solve your metabolic problems with diet alone. And so both of these are useful. So what's wonderful about muscles is that they soak up glucose like a sponge. Working muscles soak up glucose like a sponge. And so no insulin required. So your muscles will open the doors to glucose and let it in because they need the energy, right? And so that can help keep your glucose levels in better control and help you, and can improve insulin sensitivity and reduce the amount of insulin that you need to get rid of all that glucose. What your muscles do is they help you squirrel away that glucose, which normally, if you're sitting around all day, insulin has to do all the heavy lifting. If you're building muscle, the muscles can do a lot of that heavy lifting for you. So that's, I think, what's going on there. Now, I want to come back to something else you'd asked about was we don't have a continuous insulin monitor. I mean, I would absolutely love to have a continuous insulin monitor, but the next best thing, I mean, if you really want to know what, fasting insulin is one thing because by morning insulin levels, are probably lower than they were the day before because you've been fasting overnight, right? So, but what's happening to the insulin throughout the rest of the day? What's happening to it after you eat, and that sort of thing. So, how high is it running on average? We don't know. But the beautiful thing about a ketogenic diet is as I said, it reliably lowers insulin levels. And when you lower insulin levels to a certain point, that will turn fat burning enzymes on. So when your insulin levels are too high, that turns fat burning enzymes off. You can't burn fat if your insulin level is too high. When it comes down low enough, you will start burning fat and you will start making ketones. So ketones are the mirror image of your insulin level. So if you've got high ketones, you've got low insulin and vice versa. So for people who are following a ketogenic diet, which I know is not everybody in your audience, if you're following a ketogenic diet, you're almost as though you're testing your insulin levels kind of indirectly, because you know what I mean. And so I think a useful measure if people are wondering, if they have high insulin. If you're never in ketosis at any point in the day or night, your insulin levels are probably a little too high.
That makes sense. So going back to the ketogenic diet, as a psychiatrist and also having run a clinical study, we'll talk about that in a second, and, working with patients, helping them get better, you're largely, I would imagine, patients who are coming to you who have, a mental health disorder, maybe not diagnosed yet, you'll diagnose it for them, and they're struggling with symptoms. Largely, I would imagine that many of them are dealing with, poor metabolic health. And the ketogenic diet is a fantastic therapeutic tool that's there that you've demonstrated that can get people incredible results. I mean, we've had individuals on this podcast, like Hannah Warren, who's now at the Bazooki group and the Metabolic Mind group, share her testimonial of how going on a ketogenic diet, and she did it as a vegetarian because that was kind of part of her sort of spiritual and moral beliefs about not eating animals, which, I have compassion for, anybody that feels that that's important to them. And she reversed her type 1 bipolar disorder going on a ketogenic diet. So, our audience is very familiar, with that. And it's one of the most exciting things and tools in the toolbox as you've shared. For individuals that are here that don't have something that they feel is a mental health condition, or they don't feel that they have those symptoms, how do you want to share with them about who should consider or not consider a ketogenic diet? Or, are there other themes that they can be taking about your nutritional recommendations and incorporating into their diet just to fine tune the direction that they're heading in?
Great. So I made a point in my book. I worked very hard in the book to have it not just be about ketogenic diets, because even though, again, they're the cornerstone of my practice, I find them fascinating. I think they're really, really powerful tools. Not everybody wants to go on a ketogenic diet. For some people, ketogenic diet is a non-starter, right? And I understand that. And B, not everybody needs to go on a ketogenic diet. It depends on your metabolic health and your personal goals, right? So I really wanted in this book to have people to have there be different levels of different strategies that people could use to kind of connect to and grab onto and try, depending on on their metabolic health, their response to different dietary strategies. And so there is a dietary strategy in the book, which is just kind of a lower carbohydrate strategy where you can have a serving of carbohydrate with every meal. You can have about 90 grams of carbohydrate per day. And that's going to really be, I think, help a lot of people whether they ever progress to a ketogenic diet or not, that's going to lower your glucose levels. It's going to take a lot of pressure off your insulin system. And if you're lucky, it may be all you need to do, right, to protect yourself, to get your fasting insulin level in a good range, to get your triglycerides down, to see whatever other health changes you were hoping to make. So that alone may be all people need to do, is clean up their diet and kind of take down the amount of carbohydrate in the diet if they're not feeling well. That's a strategy you can try. But then if that's not good enough, if your glucose levels are still rising too much after meals, if your fasting insulin is too high, if your triglycerides are still running too high, triglycerides are a wonderful reflection of whether or not you're eating too much carbohydrate for your metabolism, right? Because excess carbohydrate gets turned into fat that floats around in the bloodstream. So if that doesn't get you where you're trying to go, then you can go to the next level, which is a ketogenic diet. But you may not need to do that. Or if you don't want to do that, you can at least benefit from making some other changes to the diet. And I spell out a lot of different things that people can do to improve the brain healthy. I want everybody to be able to improve their brain health through dietary changes. And going to a ketogenic diet is not the only way to do it. So there are so many other changes you can make that can make a very big difference in the quality of your life and in your mental health and your physical health. So many other changes you can make. You just have to know what the right ones are, what the ones that are actually worth making are. So I've listed those in the books. You can pick from a menu of different changes: refined carbohydrates, seed oils, junk foods, grains. Try grain-free, try legume-free, lots of different try dairy-free, many different strategies you can try. But if you want fundamental restructuring of the diet and optimal metabolic and mental health, if you follow this kind of three plan roadmap that I've got in the book, which starts with this lower glycemic, lower carbohydrate, uniquely modified paleo diet, then you're going to get so much more out of that intervention than this sort of nibbling at your diet around the edges. If you nibble at your diet around the edges, that's exactly the kind of results you're going to see. You're going to see, maybe I feel a little bit here. I don't know. It's nothing really to write home about. But if you fundamentally restructure your diet in the ways that make biological sense, you are going to see much better results.
Let's talk about some of your hot takes on some topics that can seem to the outside as controversial, but really there's a whole reason, rhyme, method, and science about why you feel that way. So I'm going to go through a list of a few different things that I'd love for you to chat about. So the first one is that, you talked about how a lot of superfoods that are out there are not really superfoods in the way that we see them, that in themselves, the science that touts their benefits are often concentrated forms. And if you extrapolate how much would be needed, it'd be astronomical levels of these things. Dark chocolate, you mentioned red wine, which a lot of people on my podcast know about. And there's this flip side where you've shared that if there is a food that actually would be deserving, or a category of food that would be deserving of that title, superfood, even though you're not a fan of it, you would say that meat actually is, in its truest form, one of the most fundamental foods for human beings. So I'd love for you to chat about meat, because when a lot of people hear that meat is a superfood, they start to think, whoa, what's going on here?
Great. So I have a whole chapter about meat called Meat, the original superfood. And I opened that chapter with a quote, and I'm going to by Tommy Smothers, the late great Tommy Smothers, who just passed away recently, who said, red meat is not bad for you. Now, blue-green meat, that's bad for you. And so this chapter really takes down every myth I've come across, but there will be more. As soon as the book comes out, there'll be more myths out there to be crushed. But red meat has really gotten a bad rap. And when I say that meat is good for you, I mean, I'm not talking just about red meat. I'm talking about really the meat of any animal. So it can be, seafood, poultry, meat, the whole gamut of animal meat. And so The reason why meat is surprisingly good for you, and why the brain actually hopes that you will include at least some animal food in the diet, is because meat is the only food that contains every nutrient we need in its proper form and without any toxins or anti-nutrients. And you cannot say that about any plant food. So it really is superior in every way, nutritionally and even from a toxicity point of view, to every plant food. And so this is extremely important. And I think it's very difficult to explain to people who have heard for 40, 50 years, maybe longer, that red meat is responsible for worldwide death and destruction, that's destroying every aspect of our health. It's so counterintuitive to hear this message. And that's why I spent an entire chapter explaining why it's so good for you and what's wrong with the science behind the messages that meat are bad for you. And I think if people are curious enough to take a look at, what's wrong with the World Health Organization's, proclamation that red meat causes colon cancer, I've broken all that down in the chapter. I hope in a way that will make sense to people so they can follow it. If you're curious to know, why is it that plant-based diets we're always told that they're so much healthier, I have a whole chapter called The Plant-Based Brain, Going Out on a Limb, which explains the flaw, the sort of secret that people don't know about plant-based diet research is that there has never been a study where there are definitely studies where it shows that a so-called plant-based or vegetarian or vegan diet, depending on the study, that vegetarian and vegan diets, in many studies, including randomized controlled trials, will look as though they're healthier. And so that's absolutely true. So those studies do exist. What people don't know about those studies is that those studies did not simply remove animal foods from the diet. They made lots and lots of other changes to the diet, such as, removing almost all of the fat, including all of the vegetable oils, removing all the refined carbohydrates, adding exercise or smoking cessation, or refraining from alcohol or stress reduction techniques. And they compared that complete package that happened to include a vegetarian vegan diet to a junky standard American diet that happened to include meat. That is not a fair comparison. So we don't have a study that's been conducted properly yet, where all you're doing is swapping out the animal foods for plant foods and leaving every other element of the diet alone. That's what we need to see, but we don't see that happening. So yes, whole foods, plant-based diets are healthier than junky standard American diets that contain meat. That's absolutely true. But that's really all we know.
Outside of the foods, stress is a huge part of leaky gut. Chronic emotional stress, which we all experience at some point, I kind of think of as a primer, right? 2, medications. And there's a few in that medication category, but 2 big ones that stand out to me. Non-steroidal anti-inflammatories are very, very potent triggers of intestinal permeability. And antibiotics are very potent triggers of intestinal permeability. And then the third category is chemicals. You and I were having a chat before we started about food additives, food coloring, gums, glues, right? The way that we grow our food, having lots of pesticides and glyphosate associated with them. There are, so many things in that list as potential very strong triggers of intestinal permeability. It's hard to keep track, but I'll say chemicals, particularly glyphosate, to me is a very big trigger. So, you're living in the modern world. You're getting lots of exposures to these things all the time. We experience lots of emotional stress. It's very difficult to pinpoint one. I think it's really all of those things that we talked about.
Let's so just to recap those for the audience, we have stress.
Mm-hmm.
You had chemicals as well,
Mm-hmm.
and then drugs, and you gave a couple particular types of drugs.
Yeah.
Let's look at those. So what is stress doing to the body, like both chronic stress, where somebody's experiencing a heavy load of stress in their life from work or from some sort of situation they might be in, but also like very key stressful moments. I often hear from friends that I refer to people's practices. I've sent some people to your practice, other practices before. I said, it's the first time a doctor asked me what was going on in your life emotionally when that disease or for those symptoms first started for you. So why do you ask questions like that? And what is stress doing that would be impacting that barrier inside of our body?
All right, I'll answer the first part. So then we'll go on to the immunological mechanisms. Why do I ask that question of my patients? Part of it is experience. I think the more that you spend time in the healing arts trying to work on something purely scientific, purely physiologic, purely, let's say, just immune system, you're going to find yourself hitting roadblocks over and over again with that patient that don't make sense on paper, or at least don't make sense immunologically. And the thing that you have to understand is that we as human beings are very complicated, and we are physiologically impacted by the way we feel and perceive our world. So if I'm going to be effective as a healer, I have to understand that and incorporate that into my treatment algorithm, into the way that I approach this. This is a complicated human being who's had a life, who has emotions about many things. All of that needs to be addressed if we're going to work on their immune system. So experience has given me that humble lesson that I'm going to be at my best. I'm going to help the person in front of me the most if I address their emotional state and their immunological, physiological state. That's backed by literature, by the way. I remember one of the studies that kind of opened my eyes a little bit about this was a retrospective study on MS patients from the University of Pittsburgh. I can't remember the exact year, but a very high percentage of the flares of their MS patients were triggered by a significant emotional event prior to the flare. So, the effect of the emotional state on the immunological state to me is 1-to-1.
Yeah, like if you have all of a sudden a death in the family, how's that not going to impact your health?
Right.
We all know that you can become so stressed that you can get an ulcer. Right. But you can also get so stressed that your body becomes in total panic mode. And if that stress continues with other insults, dietary, chemicals, food exposures, whatever it might be, that can have some serious impact on your body.
Yeah. So let's take the ulcer example because it's a good segue into the physiology of this, though I don't think we really understand it very well. But, the classic stress response is the adrenal stress response and a big release of cortisol as part of that fight or flight mechanism. Cortisol being a potent steroid will have immune modulating effect. Depending on the amount and the context, typically you're either going to upregulate the immune system for a short period of time, or if it's a very large release, you're going to suppress the immune system. You also change metabolic dynamics as well too, increasing the amount of glycogen output from the liver to increase the amount of glucose in the blood. I think that there have to be very significant stress-induced changes to the more advanced part of the immune system as well too. Though there are some suggestions of how that occurs, we don't have full understanding of those mechanisms. To me, I think people who have very significant day-to-day emotional stressors, you'll see very wiped out immune systems for them. You'll see their T cells depleted, and specifically the big, traffic cop of the T cells, which is a T regulatory cell, you'll oftentimes see very dysfunctional. That's the thing that's trying to control all of the sides and create balance. And it's unable to do so because it's very deficient.
One thing I like in your book is that you go through and you share all these different patient stories that are there, little case studies, reports, maybe changing it or only keeping the patient's first name or putting a different name for their privacy. Is there a patient that you can remember in your thousands of patients you've seen over the years who it was very clear that this stressful situation that happened to them, whatever it might be, was the beginning of what ultimately led to the unraveling of all these symptoms that were later for them. Anything that comes to mind that you can share with our audience here today, like a particular situation, event, something in their life that they knew they went through? They knew it was a stressful situation, but they didn't make that connection between that and then their disease state that was there.
Yeah, I can think, as you're saying that, I have like a flood of memories of different patients where that's occurred. I have a particular patient who was very, very dear to me, a woman in her 50s, a few autoimmune conditions, very difficult to kind of say how much work went into this from a lifestyle perspective, but let's say years of work in lifestyle medicine trying to help control, I think some of the autoimmune issues. And it wasn't until that patient gave me the honor of discussing some of the trauma from the past and that she got a chance to connect the dots that her father's death 3 months before the onset of autoimmunity was the trigger for her, that we actually started making major headway.
Right. And it's not that we're saying that, okay, somebody passes away in your family and immediately you're going to get an autoimmune disease. It's just though in her case, that might have been, in functional medicine, they use this analogy of like a cup filling up, drip, 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 another drip of water. Yeah. And slowly that cup fills up over time. So it could be in her case, you mentioned she was 50 when you saw her. She maybe didn't have the best diet, and that's a few drips that are there. Then she has some food sensitivities. Then there's some chemical exposure. Then other aspects that are there. And then you're maybe not working out as much. And who knows what all the combination of things are for her. And then you get a major stressor that comes in, the passing of a father in this instance. And then that's that final pour, then the whole glass of water ends up overpouring.
Absolutely. The immune system works on cascade levels, cascade layers, right? So you've got all of these things that happened on the road to that event that put the immune system in the unfortunate perfect situation to be tipped over. And that tipping over event for some people could be an antibiotic. It could be extended use of a nonsteroidal. It could be, food poisoning event, or it could be an emotional stressor. A very significant emotional stressor. They're all equivalent to the immune system. It sees all of them the same. Whether we understand them from a physical perspective or we don't, to the immune system, they end up being the same thing.
You mentioned drugs is another category that we talked about. And we've done a lot of episodes on this podcast. And I think there's a lot more awareness in the community, in the health community as a whole, that antibiotics, right, have so many positive aspects to them and were a major part of keeping humanity healthy and other stuff. Then there became the overuse of antibiotics. In the cases of antibiotics being a key aspect of somebody's journey of inducing leaky gut, what are some examples of why somebody might have continued or been exposed to antibiotics as one drug to treat one thing, but nobody told them that it could cause something else? Are there examples of diseases, issues, something that people are trying to treat with regular antibiotic usage?
To me, the most common area where that pitfall occurs is sinus infections.
Sinus infections.
Yeah. And oftentimes somebody will be experiencing a sinus infection or what's suspected to be a sinus infection, giving an additional or initial round of an antibiotic. 14 days later, they've taken the antibiotic. Hey, doc, my symptoms are still there. Oh, the problem is we didn't use a strong enough antibiotic, right? Then a second one is implemented for 14 days. Symptoms are still there. We just didn't use it for long enough, right? Then you get another 14 days, sometimes a third antibiotic to follow that. And we're talking about oral systemic antibiotics for a localized mucosal immune system. So what has happened in that situation is you have created an extraordinary amount of damage to the microbiome, created intestinal barriers that are open, and who knows if you triggered that immunological cascade or not, but the likelihood is going to be high.
So let's connect the dots for people. So you're taking an antibiotic, right? In this case, you're talking about people getting prescribed from their doctor, again, well-intentioned, not following the latest and the best science that's out there, but hey, that's not the doctor's fault. It's not being taught in medical school.
Absolutely.
So they're being given an antibiotic. So what is the role of bacteria when it comes to that barrier in our body? And how do our bacteria keep us healthy and safe?
So the entire mucosal immune system, particularly the small intestinal epithelial layer, that barrier, contains signal receptors. So it is, let's say, constantly putting an antenna out to survey the internal environment, and it is looking for patterns. They are called pattern associated receptors, or pattern recognition, right? So what patterns is it looking for? It's looking for the presence of healthy immune cells and the presence of healthy microorganisms, whether they are bacteria or yeast, or vice versa, the lack of healthy immune cells or dysbiotic organisms. And if it senses a lack of healthy immune cells and dysbiotic organisms, it is going to upregulate all of the immune system in the mucosal barrier, which makes someone much more prone or likely to end up with a permeability event, and that permeability event being prolonged rather than being able to resolve.
So kind of like I came back from travel abroad, come back into the country, you have to go through customs. And just to use a crude analogy here, but let's say there's a breakdown of the border at the airport for where customs is, to determine, again, keeping politics and everything else aside, just talking about basic country borders. All countries have borders. There is a customs that's trying to say, okay, hey, are you a citizen of this country, or do you have a valid reason to be here, or do you have a visa, whatever. So we're saying, in a way, those protections, which our bacteria can be a part of, if they're not there, or if they're not a part of the equation to help keep that border safe, then the hawkish individuals in charge will say, hey, we need to line up a bunch more soldiers and let's be on high alert because we could be being attacked from invaders from the outside.
Yeah. And a couple of innocent bystanders are going to get picked up along with the bad guys along the way, because when everything is so heightened and they're looking for a problem, they're going to get not only the bad guys, but some of the good guys too.
Totally. I'm brown. Hey, let's go shoot everybody who's brown. And it's like, hey, hold on, I'm Indian. We're peaceful, chill.
Yeah.
But I'm going to get shot anyway because the immune system is super ramped up.
Yes.
So that's good for people to understand, because we often want to see the human body as like these individual little silos that don't communicate with each other. And like you said, we don't fully understand it, but we know enough to know there is a deep intelligence that's going on where all these systems are relying on each other. So the idea that we can take an antibiotic, again, well-intentioned, incorrect, but well-intentioned for, let's say, sinuses, sinus infection, and it not have an impact in some sort of other area is actually kind of crazy when you look at it through the lens of functional medicine.
Yeah, especially when you want to even zoom out a little bit and say, okay, well, the antibiotic was going to work if there indeed was a bacterial infection in the sinuses, and that bacteria was uniquely responsible for the inflammation of the sinus and was also susceptible to the antibiotic that you gave, right? So,
Right.
But we have no mechanism to determine if the bacterial agent is actually the cause of the inflammation of the sinuses. And in fact, many things can inflame a sinus and create the perception of a sinus infection, and you would be getting the antibiotic for what purpose in that reason, in that
Exactly.
situation, right?
Even though sometimes people do get an antibiotic and they feel a little bit better.
Right.
In the case of a sinus infection, what is actually happening in that situation where they do feel a little bit better? Again, there's overuse, and that leads to degradation of the gut and it may not even be the best solution. The best solution would be, hey, why are you getting so sick so often?
For
what's
sure.
What's going on in the first place?
Right. The appropriately functioning, balanced mucosal immune system that lives just next to that layer of your sinuses is to clear out bad bacteria, bad yeast, viruses, whatever. So you should be asking a question about what is holding the mucosal immune system back from doing what it's supposed to do, right? My whole idea is, how do I get this person's body back to doing what nature designed for it to do incredibly well? And when it comes to why antibiotics work sometimes for sinus infections, even though it may not have been a bacterial infection.
Yeah.
Well, why does a Z-Pak work for a cold sometimes, right? It's a very, very good question. Azithromycin, doxycycline, many other antibiotics have actual immune modulating property. So they will take an overly active immune system and decrease its activity. And the way you feel that is inflammation present, inflammation gone. So your presumption, if you connect those two dots, is, oh, it must have been bacteria. But you're forgetting that the drug itself has anti-inflammatory property. How does it exhibit those anti-inflammatory properties? We don't entirely know. I think one of the most reasonable theories is that in our modern world, we have very overpopulated dysbiotic guts. And if you take an antibiotic, you're going to temporarily relieve the burden of that. The immune system will see that, will calm down for a period of time, and there'll be systemic anti-inflammatory effect. The drugs themselves may also have direct impact on the immune system as well. It's a little bit of a debate. Probably both are true. But just because you took an antibiotic doesn't mean you killed the bacteria that caused the sinus infection.
Yeah, it's an important point. And I think it's part of the world and medicine, and this has happening in a lot of different categories, is that both aspects can be true. It can work in these small instances, but is that really the root issue? And then what are the total harms that are coming along with it? And now I think we're waking up to the fact that, again, we talked about it before, antibiotics can very much part of our history, everything like that. We're very thankful for them, but where are they doing more damage than good?
Yeah.
So let's go back to chemicals, right? We talked a lot about glyphosate, but we were chatting about food additives.
Mm-hmm.
How is it that certain food additives, and many of them actually banned in other countries, but we still allow here because of corporate input and lobby and the FDA and everything like that. But how is it that certain chemically set up food additives could be responsible behind either aggravating leaky gut, and in some people who are more sensitive, because everybody's body is different. I was just telling you about a friend of mine who's been on the podcast before, Vani Hari, the food babe. And for her in particular, food additives were a major part of her eczema and skin issues that she had. So what's going on in that situation? What inside of the body that would be disrupting the gut?
I think there's two kind of clear scenarios. One is the food additive, whether it's an artificial dye or sweetener or filler or gum, is directly causing permeability, breakdown, leaky gut, and therefore damaging the immune system in that kind of direct way. We're consuming it, so the gut lining is going to be exposed to it. If it directly damages the gut lining, that's pretty straightforward. And
the damage that it's doing, does that also mean that sometimes it could be acting like its own little antibiotic in that area? Or is it inflammation? Like, how is that actual damage? Like, how is it killing off the healthy stuff that we have there inside of our gut? Do we know?
It depends on the chemical. So some of the chemicals do have actual septic effects, so they can antiseptic effects, so they can cleanse the bacteria of the healthy bacteria, or cleanse the gut of healthy bacteria. So acting like an antibiotic. Some of them will directly open the barrier. Gums are a very good example of something that will directly open the barrier. The problem with gums specifically, which I think is the big culprit in the food additive world, is some of them don't even need to be labeled.
And just so people are clear, because some people are like, wait, is he talking about chewing gum?
No.
Like, what is he talking about? Okay, so when you say gums, what are gums and what are some common food products? And then what would be on the label that we would often be looking at to see, does this product have this gum inside of it?
Thanks for asking. So gums are emulsifiers or thickening agents. So think of chewing gum, but trying to create that elasticity or thickness to food. And there are many different forms of gums: guar gum, carrageenan, xanthan gum, locust bean gum. These are all examples of different thickening agents or emulsifiers that are used in the food industry to provide essentially texture differences to food, right?
To create that mouthfeel that often people are looking for.
Yes, right. I'll give you a great example of where they're used very widely. Ice cream, in particularly vegan ice cream, because you're not going to get that, like thick milk fat consistency by using almond milk or coconut milk or whatever it is you decide to use. So to recreate that experience to the mind and the body, to convince you that you're having regular cow's milk ice cream, gums are used to thicken.
Yeah. There was a really amazing, I'm not vegan, but it's a vegan ice cream I came across here at Air One of our favorite stores.
The
locally.
Money Pit.
The Money Pit. And I came across it there, and it was a I love the fact that it had just a couple ingredients inside, right? It had like cacao, sea salt, water, and allulose, which, we'll talk about in a second, but it's a non-sugar sweetener alternative, and a lot of health products are using it. I'd love to get your take on the situation. And it had xanthan gum in it.
Yeah.
And I tried it and I loved it because we do a lot of episodes on blood sugar. Like, wow, this is great because it has allulose in it. It's not spiking my blood sugar. I don't eat ice cream all the time. And I emailed the founders and I said, hey, listen, just want to share myself, Dr. Hyman, a lot of the experts that have been on our podcast. We're not usually the biggest fan of xanthan gum. Do we think it's the worst thing in the world? No, you're just trying to balance everything out. But long-term for a health aware audience, if possible, it'd be a good thing to look at some alternatives in the manufacturing process. And they were so sweet. They were like, oh my gosh, we didn't know. We'll definitely look into it. Let's see what other alternatives are there. But you're right. They're in a lot of vegan products that are there. So in the case of these gums, right? And you mentioned a few of them that are out there. Do we understand exactly the ways that they're creating disruption? Going back to the last question I asked, is it like a cleansing effect? Is it like sort of antiseptic effect, or are we not really fully sure?
I think there's two big ways that it can cause an immunological problem that we're sure about. I am sure that there are many that we don't know about in totality. One will be direct damage to the barrier. So gums can directly go in, let's say like gluten, and just, activate the zonulin pathway, create leaky gut, essentially. The other way is that some individuals will actually create immune responses to gums. So again, let's say somebody has non-celiac gluten sensitivity. That's an issue where the immune system is inappropriately identifying a food as a target and creating an immune response, including antibodies to it whenever you ingest it. The same thing can happen to a gum.
Got it.
So you can either immune attack or it'll open up your barriers, or both, right? And there are plenty of other things that it can do.
There is one gum product that's out there that I believe is like not in the same category of the gums. And a lot of wellness products use it, like a lot of the functional medicine products. It's called acacia gum.
Yeah.
And that's just straight up acacia fiber.
Yep.
But I think they have to call it gum on the label.
Correct.
That's not what you're talking about here.
No.
Okay.
No. So
great.
Acacia gum, sun fiber, whatever term you're going to use, let's call that a prebiotic.
Right. These are prebiotics.
This is a direct emulsifier, thickening agent, texture modifier for food. Though they can act as prebiotics in some situations, they're mostly directly harmful.
I asked you about allulose.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts about allulose?
I think allulose is a little hit or miss depending on the individual. I think some people, again, it's very hard to predict how a microbiome is going to react to something. Is it going to digest it and ferment it rapidly and create a large amount of gas, and that gas causes discomfort? Or is the microbiome not going to be able to ferment it at all and it'll just pass through? It's very individual. For people who can tolerate it, my blessings for sure.
It's interesting because, and again, for those that are not familiar, allulose is a non-sugar, doesn't spike your blood sugar. It can be extracted from, I believe, figs, kiwi, a lot of things, and there's an area where a lot of people are like cautiously optimistic. And the cautious part primarily comes from this, is that most of the allulose that's on the market today is extracted from, what I understand, from wheat and corn. It doesn't have any wheat and corn inside of it, and the companies test and everything else like that. So it doesn't show up on any of these sensitivities, but that's the easiest way to get the chemical extraction out for this chemical compound that is similar to sugar, but is not sugar in the body. If I have a little bit and I have a product that has a little bit in it, totally fine. Because I'm always trying things, and I know I'm an N of 1 situation. I added a lot to a latte that I was making one time, like 2 tablespoons of like pure, or like 3 tablespoons of like pure allulose. And I had what would be sort of like a little bit of like digestive upset. Hey, it's a health podcast, so we could say it. I basically had diarrhea.
Yeah.
So some things can be good a little bit, and maybe some things a lot may not be good, and it might vary different people. But it does seem that people are cautiously optimistic, because it seems to be that if we can get people off of some sugar in some instances, it could be beneficial. And then again, a lot of functional medicine doctors also say that, look, it's not that we should be afraid of sugar. We just don't want to be having it for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So the occasional sugar here and there is totally fine. we also don't want to be having allulose breakfast, lunch, and dinner.
Yeah.
So that's the whole allulose monologue that I have.
I like it. I agree with it. I'm on board with your model.
We talked about food, and food is a big part of your book here, When Food Bites Back. In the instance of top foods that people are eating today that we know are connected to leaky gut in one way or another, you mentioned two right off the bat. You talked about dairy and gluten.
Mm-hmm.
Would you put those two in, let's say, your list of top, 10 foods that are often linked with leaky gut?
Yeah, those are number 1 and 2 without question. And not just link with leaky gut, but link with systemic autoimmunity, specific systemic autoimmunity. So those are the kings of the hill, no question.
And autoimmunity, a few years ago when we when I first got in the space of functional medicine, before I started working with Dr. Hyman, I had another business partner. I heard people talking about autoimmunity a lot at the functional medicine conferences, different doctors and things like that. I thought, autoimmunity is so rare. Like, why is it being talked about so much? Then I finally looked up the stats. It's not rare at all.
Yeah.
Tell us about how popular autoimmunity is, and why is it that in particular, which is going to be really interesting for this audience, my audience is probably about 80% women.
Mm-hmm.
Why is this topic so important for especially women
Mm-hmm.
to pay attention to?
Yeah. So depending on the statistic metric that you want to look at, somewhere between 10 to 15% of the current US population has a known diagnosed autoimmune disease. Okay.
Nuts.
The reason that's, if you want to put that together with, let's say, Alzheimer's disease or cardiovascular disease, we're talking about equal portions of the population actively impacted. There's a couple of reasons why that isn't palpable day to day, or it doesn't get talked about that much. The biggest of which is that autoimmune diseases get segmented into different subspecialties of medicine. In other words, there is no quote unquote autoimmunologist in medicine. There is no autoimmunology residency. You don't go to an autoimmunologist.
Because they think of them all as separate things.
Right. You have Hashimoto's, you go to an endocrinologist. You have Crohn's, you go to a GI doctor. You have MS, you go to a neurologist. So we lose the ability to think of this as an immunological disease, which it is. Not that those people aren't, good at treating them. It's you forget that this is a very, very big bucket. Now, those are conservative estimates. And on average, an autoimmune disease from when it is formed in the bloodstream, so when you start developing the antibodies against the tissue and the person gets diagnosed with the autoimmune disease, is about 8 to 10 years. So if those metrics are conservative, they're also reflective of what was going on actively in our bloodstream 10 years ago. So I think those of us in this world who live and breathe it every day think that number is probably closer to 20%. If you look at good studies that look at the nationwide seroprevalence of autoimmune markers like a positive ANA or a positive cardiolipin, we had that at about 11% 10 years ago. I think, again, that number is probably 15 or 20% right now. It is a huge, huge problem.
Women, why is autoimmunity a topic that everybody should pay attention to, but women in particular?
It's mostly conjecture at this point, right? We kind of look at the past and say, well, what's the difference between, men and women to explain this, right? We know autoimmune disease is an environmental disease, right? So that means that let's put over 2/3 of the risk of autoimmunity is environment versus genes. And
environment means everything from food to chemicals to stress, like the larger environment that we're surrounded by.
Everything we've been talking about, right? Put a huge number of things into that bucket, but the environment. And women are unfortunately exposed to more in the environment than men are. That's most likely secondary to cosmetics. And on top of it, hormonal changes influence the immune system, right? A perfect example of that is, let's say a woman unfortunately has psoriasis, goes into pregnancy. Typically in the second and third trimesters of pregnancy, that psoriasis will on its own reduce its activity, and because hormones have an impact on the immune system. So of course, women have a more diverse range of sex hormones. There is more influence of the immune system. There's more fluctuation intra-month of their sex hormones. So that's likely the secondary kicker there, is why women experience 3 times more autoimmunity than men.
Right. In your book, you open it up with 70 to 80% of almost all autoimmune diagnoses fall on women.
Yeah.
You mentioned makeup.
Mm-hmm.
Talk about makeup for a second. Cosmetics. Makeup is one category of that, but just let's go cosmetics, stuff we put on our hair, stuff we put elsewhere. Obviously, there's such a burden that's placed on just the way that the world works on women and their appearance. And there's actually a really good book, if anybody's interested. There's a PhD researcher. Her name is Luann Brisdine. She wrote a book called The Female Brain.
Mm-hmm.
She also wrote a book called The Male Brain.
Mm-hmm.
And she talks about why, from a young age, biologically female brain, biologically male brain, why is it that certain, a brain would pay attention to more, this aspect or another aspect? Why is it that men have more neuro connections front to back and women have more from one hemisphere to another hemisphere?
Mm-hmm.
How does that play out in evolutionary biology? But cosmetics, how do those impact the body and the gut, which ultimately impacts autoimmune?
Yeah. Let's do the gut part first. Okay. So an individual is putting things on their skin on a daily basis. Those, the skin is, again, an analog to what's going on inside of the gut from a physiological perspective. We're covered in epithelial cells here. We're covered in epithelial cells down there. What you do to the epithelial cells here impact them here, and vice versa. So what you put on your skin on a daily basis can impact the health of your gut. They're the same style of cells, and the immune system connects the two areas. So something can disrupt the barrier on your skin. It can disrupt the barrier in your gut. And if there's something that has antimicrobial effect on your skin and you're using it every day, it's going to have some cumulative antimicrobial effect on your gut. And those chemicals directly in cosmetics, they have an incredible amount of stress to the immune system associated with them.
And one other aspect is that, people like to talk about a lot of industries being unregulated. Cosmetics is completely unregulated.
That's the biggest problem. If I'm gonna list off the list of things that are bad in, let's say, mascara or foundation or lipstick or lotion, right? There are going to be things that you can find that are in there that are listed, and there are going to be things that are not listed because they're not mandated to be listed.
That also includes fragrances as well.
Absolutely.
We don't really know what's inside of them. They seem very innocent. They seem very, like, wow, it's just a fragrance. Like, what's the big deal? There's all sorts of phthalates, chemicals, things that we have no idea. And they are trade secrets because these companies don't want anybody to know.
Right.
We have no idea what's inside of them. And they also want to protect them because they don't want somebody else to copy it. But we as a consumer end up suffering.
Yeah. And, outside of cosmetics, unfortunately, there is a tremendous amount of societal pressure on biological females in our society to continue to look good, continue to look young. Not even going into the injectable or plastic surgery world, but there's a tremendous amount of chemical exposure that happens there as well too. So in the short run, women are really unfortunately impacted by our world.
It's on the positive side, it's great to see so many cleaner cosmetics show up, and organizations like Environmental Working Group having a database, and there's another company that, I was an advisor to, a nonprofit that helps sort of vet a lot of these. It's called Made Safe.
Yep.
And they're doing some really great work. So I'm excited that in all the messiness and the craziness of the world, there are people that are stepping up that say, okay, great. People want to look good. Men want to look good. Women want to look good. Let's flag products as being safer for them, which we definitely need more of in this world.
And let's also say that if that risk doesn't come in, let's say, the decades of 30, 40, or 50 as an autoimmune disease,
yes,
women are also 3 times more likely to experience neurodegeneration and a neurodegenerative disease than men.
Right. Your body can say ouch in different ways. One way of saying ouch is an autoimmune disease, which, again, most people don't say I have an autoimmune disease. They'll say I have Graves' disease, I have Hashimoto's, I have, another MS. And if it doesn't end up happening as an autoimmune disease, it could end up happening as something else. We had brain researcher on the podcast, Dr. Lisa Mosconi,
Mm-hmm.
and she wrote a book called The XX Brain and talked about why is it that women are more likely to get Alzheimer's?
Yeah.
You know, what's going on in this instance? And it's not because women live longer. We used to think it was that, but it's actually because of all the reasons that you had listed a little bit earlier. So I want to go back to leaky gut and autoimmunity. You know, those two things are very much connected. And question that I have for the audience, can somebody develop autoimmune issues or eventually a diagnosis of some of the diseases that we mentioned? And there's many others. I think there's total like more than 80 plus different diseases
Mm-hmm.
that fall under the bucket of autoimmunity.
Mm-hmm.
Can someone get an autoimmune disease without having leaky gut?
I think the answer to that is yes. It is not necessary for leaky gut to be a part of autoimmunity. I think you're going to be hard pressed to find an autoimmune disease that doesn't, in at least the medical literature, have an association between the gut abnormality and the systemic autoimmune disease, but they definitely don't have to overlap. I think it's just incredibly common. And at the end of the day, you know, I think you're also going to be very hard pressed to find a human being who has not had intestinal permeability at some point in their life.
Are people being misled? Yes, they're being misled if when they go to the store and they buy certified organic eggs, if they think that those eggs came from a pasture, you know, with chickens running around happily, most of the time now in America, they're being misled. Probably 80% of the eggs being sold are coming from large confinement operations where the chickens never go outside. If they do, they go out to a little concrete yard that's like a prison exercise yard.
Yeah, you actually have a great image from a presentation you did. This is where what people think buying eggs from an organic farm looks like. And then right next to it here on the screen here, we've placed, you know, what the typical type of place growing these chickens and raising these eggs are, which are called again? These, you said confined...
The confinement operations, they're often called CAFOs.
CAFOs.
CAFO stands, CAFO, it stands for a concentrated animal feeding operation. It's a USDA term to define a certain kind of farm. And these are large confinement CAFOs. And they're not nice. You wouldn't like to be in one. You'd stop eating eggs, or if you go to a large confinement CAFO dairy or beef operation, you might stop eating meat at all.
Yeah, even if it's organic.
Even if it's certified organic.
Even if it's certified organic, we're still being misled. So that's number one, CAFOs. What's another way that people who are buying organic are being misled in terms of what they think they're getting?
Well, the second big one would be things that were grown without any soil at all. They're grown hydroponically, and their roots, sometimes they're in water and the fertilizer just run in the water, and sometimes they're in shredded coconut husks and the fertilizer is dripped in. But there's no soil involved, and a whole miraculous cycle of fertility that makes really superb quality food is missing. It's a whole different thing.
And when we're getting food that's hydroponic, even if it's certified organic, what are the potential implications, right? I've heard you say that it could be, in certain instances, less nutritious. Is that accurate? Like less vitamins, less nutrients compared to being grown in soil?
It's certainly different from what's grown in soil. Nobody questions that. We know when you change the soil, how you manage the soil, it changes the nutrition. And we know that if you do a totally different system of growing stuff without any soil at all, it changes the nutrition. Drew, you know as well as anybody how complex nutrition is. We barely know what is good nutrition. We know pretty well what's bad nutrition. We know Doritos are bad nutrition. But to really understand the complexity of 100,000 secondary plant metabolites, we don't even know what most of them do. We don't know what their impact on our body is. But we're learning more and more all the time. And we know that some of those are potent anti-carcinogens. And when we eat food that's got those, we're less likely to get cancer. So the nutrition is a real thing, but our science is limited. So to test that stuff, we barely know how to test for those 100,000 metabolites, and we don't understand the impact of one being higher than another and how they blend and how one inhibits the uptake of another. So it's complicated. And that's why, to some degree, we have to start trusting Mother Nature, which is what real organic does. There's a belief that if we follow as closely as we can the practices of nature, and which all farming is some compromise on that. But if as close as we can get it, we're going to get the benefits of nature. We're going to get food. We co-evolved, right, with plants and this system, and that's how we are nourished. That's our natural way of getting nutrition. So when we start playing with that, thinking we're smarter than Mother Nature, we aren't. We're stupider than Mother Nature. We're clever, and we can do some things and make it work for a little while, but not for a long period of time.
You know, part of the message that you're sounding the alarm on is that the organic standards are getting hijacked because the industry has gotten so big. There's so many lobbyists and groups and individuals that are trying to make organic, which originally started off as this pure intention thing. They're trying to, in a way, bastardize it to make it easier to produce things and to sell things to the public that may be called organic, but are not as good for you as how organic started. Is that a fair way to present kind of what you're saying?
I think that's fair. I think that industry has come in and they do what industry does, which is try and simplify the systems as much as possible. They want to make it as close to McDonald's as possible, where the hamburger in Iowa is the same as the hamburger in Florida, and it takes exactly the same time to cook, and on and on. So it's a simple system. They've taken out as much of the complexity as they can. So they're trying to do that with agriculture. Hydroponics is a perfect example of that. Right now, Peru is being taken over by hydroponic production of berries, especially blueberries. And they're doing that because they don't have to worry about the variability of the soil or whether there is soil. They're just rolling out the plastic, putting the plastic pots on, filling them up with a shredded coconut husk, and then putting a drip stake into it. And they put all the feed through that drip stake. So they got a simple system now. And okay, but what do you give up with that? You give up complexity. You give up the things you don't even begin to understand that are going on in a living soil. What makes a living soil alive is all the microbial life in there, all the bacteria and the fungi and the many, many other things, many little animals. It's not just microscopic. And there's this complex ecosystem, and it's really cool. And out of all that complexity, and everyone's eating everybody else, and all good things are happening, you get this food that is so nutritious and delicious. It tastes just as good as it is for you. It tastes good to eat.
So not only is this a problem for people, and even if you're somebody who eats meat, right?
Yes.
You still want animal welfare. You want the animals to be, raised in the best way that doesn't cause, undue suffering, before the point of slaughter. But also some of these ways that we're being lied to about organic, they're also bad for the planet. Yeah. Can you chat about that?
Sure. There's a lot of conversation going on right now about something that's called climate smart agriculture. That was a term I believe that Monsanto came up with, climate smart agriculture. Same thing. Big corporation coming in and saying, rather than change our practices, let's change our image. Let's change the story we're telling. So we're going to say that what we're doing is climate smart. Now, there are ways to farm that are climate smart, but I wouldn't use that particular expression to describe them. But there are ways to farm in which there's more carbon sequestration. So the plants, through the process of photosynthesis, are pulling, the CO2 out of the air and turning it into their bodies and into the fruits. But they're also exuding it through their roots and feeding all that microbial life. And so over a long process of time, you start to get more and more organic matter in the soil, more carbon, less carbon in the air, more carbon in the ground, where it's all coming from. Our whole problem with high CO2 is that we're mining old carbon, mostly in the form of oil and coal, and we're burning it and releasing it into the air. So farming can help with that, can help to sequester and put back into the ground through this beautiful, complex biological process of photosynthesis. How does that work best? That works best in forests and in permacultures and in grasslands. So grasslands is where in all, I would say, good agriculture, there is some way in which animals are integrated into it. It might not be on your particular farm, but it's part of the cycle of some living animals are part of this system. They can be animals that you're eating, or animals that you're taking eggs from or milk from, or they could be wild animals in a wild ecosystem. In Yellowstone, you've got, elk and wolves and all these animals participating in the ecosystem.
So when you see everything that's happening right now, right, why do you feel you and your group at the Real Organic Project, right, why is it so important for you to raise awareness by coming on things like this podcast, right? What's your hope and what's your mission by sounding the alarm about how things are headed? What are you trying to avoid?
Yeah. I'm trying to avoid organic becoming a dead brand out in the marketplace that doesn't mean anything, like natural or sustainable at this point are meaningless terms in the marketplace. I first got into this because I saw that hydroponic produce was being certified as organic. And I thought, that's not right. We know that's not organic. And we decided it in the USDA 6 years earlier than I got into this. I'm like, what's going on? And I thought, surely somebody's made a mistake. And I discovered it wasn't a mistake, that they'd been quietly being lobbied for some years at that point to allow hydroponics to be certified as organic. What's wrong with it is that that's actually not what people want to buy. It's not what hydroponic is not what organic stands for. It's not what people think it stands for. As I got into it, I discovered there was all this confinement livestock. I had no idea. And most people don't have any idea. They don't have any idea that hydroponic is being allowed. So I realized that we were losing the actual essence, the soul of organic. Just as a brief diversion, organic has kind of two traditions that made it. And one is Rachel Carson, Silent Spring. And she sounded the alarm in 1962 maybe about the fact that we were poisoning ourselves with this just widespread use of pesticides. And that's nothing compared to what we're doing now with pesticides, right? It was still relatively moderate. We've changed some of the names of the pesticides, some of the pesticides we use, but herbicides now are off the charts for how much we're using compared to back then. So that was one thing that helped create the organic movement. But the other came from England, a writer, two writers, Albert Howard and Lady Eve Balfour. And they were writing about the difference in the quality of the food and your health because you're eating food grown in really fertile soil that is tended in a particular way. And that was actually where the term organic came from. It was about organic matter in the soil. So Howard wrote Soil and Health, and he wrote an agricultural testament, and they became popular books. And Rodale, J.I. Rodale, read his books and studied with him and said, this is really important, and he brought it back to the U.S. So we've got these two forces coming together to create the organic movement. And it became a movement because people got excited about it. People were concerned about the quality of their food, and they were excited that there was another way.
Can you explain hydroponics and actually what exactly it is? Because I think a lot of people, they have a big picture idea, but they don't understand, what's the incentive for big farms to want to use hydroponic? How does it work? And, again, just to reiterate, what are some of the things that it's missing?
Yeah. So the kind of slogan or catchphrase of the organic movement was feed the soil, not the plant. So a chemical farmer would synthesize some fertilizers in a processing plant and bring it out, and it's potent stuff. It works. You add that nitrogen to the soil, and the plant gets big and green in a hurry, much like eating a Big Mac. You get big and red in a hurry. So in the organic philosophy, instead of going, well, I know the plant wants nitrogen, you feed the things that are living in the soil, and you create more life. You create a community in the soil, a very diverse microbiome. We now start to have more understanding of microbiome. Soil's got a microbiome too. It's like New York City in a healthy, rich, fertile soil. There's so much going on. There's so much diversity, so many species living together, and it gets ramped up. And things that grow in that are very good for us to eat. So healthy soil, healthy plant, healthy animal, healthy human, right? In chemical agriculture, the philosophy is feed the plant, not the soil. In hydroponic growing, there is no soil. It's just feed the plant. And so they go through processing to get fertilizers that are very available to the plant to just take up. It's like an IV. You put an IV into somebody, and they're just getting the nutrition. They're not really healthy, but they're alive, right?
They're not getting sunlight. They're not getting movement. They're not getting everything else, but they are getting the basic nutrition to keep them alive. They're not dead. They're not healthy.
And it might be a wonderful thing in a certain very difficult situation. I had a group of students from Dartmouth come to me, and they're doing a project to how are you going to feed a colony on Mars, a space station on Mars. And they said, we're coming up with hydroponics is the only way because the soil is literally toxic, poisonous there. And I said, okay, well, this is how you do hydroponics. And they said, but do you think everyone will get sick? And I went, well, not for a while. How long are they going to be there? They said 10 years. I said, 10 years? Well, don't necessarily count on having kids, right? Because we don't know. We're the lab rats here. We're the guinea pigs. Nobody knows this. Nobody knows what's the impact of eating this food-like substance that wouldn't have been food before. Looks like food. Tastes not quite as good as food. But we're starting to lose our sense of taste anyway. We're very confused right now about how do we even tell what's nutritious.
What percentage of the organic produce that's out there right now is grown through hydroponic?
A lot of the tomatoes, both big and small, are grown hydroponically. A lot of those, all the peppers probably coming from Holland, and a lot of those big, beautiful peppers from Mexico are often hydroponic. A lot of the blueberries are hydroponic. Not so much yet in organic, but in all those were in organic. In conventional, even the strawberries are becoming more hydroponic. And I'd say in 10 years, that's going to be dominant. It's not yet. The greens are, the mixed greens, things like that, lettuce, are starting to be more and more hydroponic. So unless you know the farms and know which ones you choose not to buy from, it's pretty hard to tell. They won't tell you. This is the sign that people don't really want hydroponic. Because what producer brags about it? Nobody. Nobody says, oh, we're so proud we grew these hydroponically. If you go to the major producers who are selling something through organic that's actually hydroponic and ask them if they grow anything hydroponically, they will say no. They've just redefined the word. So you can't even get the truth by asking the people who are doing it, because they know that you and I don't want hydroponic when we go to buy something that's certified as organic. We want something grown in soil.
Why is it that certain countries, even if they grow hydroponic there, don't allow for that same produce to be sold in that country?
Only in the U.S. that I can think of is something that's grown hydroponically allowed to be sold as organic. So we are the pirate ship here. The greatest producer of hydroponic produce in the world is Holland. They got thousands and thousands of acres of greenhouses, and they grow a lot of tomatoes, peppers, and cucumbers. Virtually all hydroponically. The only thing that isn't grown hydroponically in those greenhouses is stuff that's grown organically. However, there are a small number of acres, 50 acres or something, that are grown hydroponically. They can't be sold as organic in Holland or anywhere in the EU, but they can be sold as organic in the US, and that's where they're shipped to. And if they, for some reason, don't have a market here, they have to sell them as conventional in Holland.
And is that simply just because those countries, like in the EU, they just have higher standards of what organic means and they're willing to uphold that?
Yeah, they have the same standards we had when we started. So we have a good law in this country. It's called the Organic Food Production Act. And honestly, Drew, it's a miracle they got this thing passed. They got it passed in, 1990. And a couple senators and congresspeople with a lot of vision pushed it through. At that point, there was no organic market to speak of in 1990. So there wasn't a lot of resistance. It's like, whatever, you all are doing what you're doing. And it's a good law, and it talks about soil and soil health and taking care of the soil, tending the soil, stewarding the soil over and over and over. And in around 2000, the USDA created the National Organic Program to actually create a certification program. And its job, it's a little branch of a huge thing. USDA is huge. National Organic Program is a very small program. Their only job was to protect the consumers and the farmers who wanted real organic, and to protect the integrity and transparency of that process. And guess what they failed at? The integrity and the transparency of that process. That is falling by the wayside. We're fighting for it. We should fight for it. We got to keep fighting for it. But in the meantime, we're going to have to do some labeling of our own in order so that people can find the food that they want. And it's a huge task because organic's pretty big now, which is wonderful. That's a sign of the fact that so many people want organic. They want an alternative to that chemical system, to that chemical industry. And organic is where they're turning. And it's where they should turn. It's the right thing. What organic means is the right thing. That's the food we should be eating. We're just going to have to fight and claw back to get that integrity and transparency.
Is there anything good about organic hydroponic in the sense that it's not being exposed to maybe certain types of pesticides?
Yeah. Same is true of the certified organic CAFOs. So the certified organic hydros and the certified organic CAFOs are better than the conventional hydros and the conventional CAFOs. So that's better. Let's consider it a transition step to real organic, right? The problem isn't that it's so bad, it's that it's not good enough. And the problem is that it changes the marketplace. So if you want real organic eggs, good luck finding them unless you know a farmer and you know, I'll buy their eggs. I'll buy Alexander's eggs. Alexander Farms has real organic eggs, right? And they're Happy Hens down in San Diego. They've got real organic eggs. But if you just walk into Vons or Whole Foods, you better bring your, detective magnifying glass to try and figure it out. It's going to be very confusing.
Let's talk about eggs for a second, because I think that's a perfect category. A lot of people eat eggs. I love eggs.
Ground zero.
So eggs, you see this explosion in the last couple of years where there's a lot of brands that are saying that, hey, we're pasture raised eggs. And generally speaking, I've told my audience here that, great, first of all, eat healthy. We don't want to make healthy eating so tough and expensive that people just don't do it. And they're like, I'm just going to eat ultra processed foods, right? We want to get away from ultra processed foods.
Absolutely.
And move towards whole foods. And then within inside of that, if you can make shifts and move towards organic, fantastic. So with eggs, we'll say, hey, listen, go get pasture raised eggs. Now, it's my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm in this field and this could be how confused I am. So there's a few different types of pasture raised eggs, right? There's pasture raised, right? Just so the audience is clear, we're not talking about pasteurized. These are chickens that are supposed to have some access to pasture, right? To be able to eat insects and whatever else they might be eating. Then there's organic certified pasture raised, which from my understanding means that the feed that these chickens are being given is organic itself. The chickens aren't certified organic. Like as a chicken, you're not certified or not certified organic, but the feed you're being given is organic. Is that accurate? That there's pasture raised, which is you have access to a pasture, and then there's organic pasture raised, which would mean that there is some blend of either having access to pasture, whether they eat things from it or not. So maybe that's an animal welfare thing, but you're still eating organic feed like corn, soy, whatever it might be.
Okay. So a lot of stuff there.
Yeah.
First of all, as far as I know, there's no legal definition of pasture raised.
Yeah.
We all think we know what it means. It means something to you. It means something to me. It doesn't necessarily mean the same thing to the egg company. So, it doesn't necessarily mean the same thing to the distributor or the retailer. So we have to be careful. There are a lot of terms, and eggs is one that's just swimming in terms. And as soon as a term comes up, we go, oh, okay, what we meant was pasture raised. And they go, great, pasture raised, right? So what does that mean to the producer? You'll have to find out. Yes, it's true. I don't think it's true that you can't certify a chicken. I think animals are certified as organic. But it's true that for a chicken to be certified, they have to be fed certified organic grain. Chickens are not like cows where they can just live off grass. They need some grain. And that grain needs to be certified organic. I say that. I don't use the word organic unless I mean real organic. So, because I'm sorry to say there's also a fair amount of fraud in organic grain, certified organic grain. And we know this. It's been big stories in the Washington Post. This is mob activity. So this is different from, I've lobbied the USDA to change the definition of now they're allowing hydroponic. This isn't allowed. It's simply corrupted. And the Washington Post ran a series of stories back around maybe 2017. A writer named Peter Wariski, fantastic job he did. He did the same about confinement dairy cattle. Very, very well done. The grain fraud was that these mobsters based in Turkey, it was the address given, would bring a giant shipload of grain, and magically over the voyage it would turn into organic grain. It was chemical when it was loaded, it was conventional when it was loaded, and when it was unloaded it was organic. And they just changed the paperwork. And this was going on scale. So many millions of dollars worth of so-called organic grain that wasn't organic. This is the fight. This is the fight that we're in. We can rend our clothes and gnash our teeth, but let's get real that we are willing to pay for something, and we're going to have to fight to make sure we're getting what we're paying for.
What is the best type of eggs we could be eating?
The best type of eggs you can be eating are coming from a small farm where the chickens run outside every day, and they're eating a combination of grain and bugs, and they're eating a little grass and forbs, and they're not super crowded, and they're going to be more expensive. So just because they're expensive doesn't mean that they're really organic. But the real thing is going to cost more than an industrial egg. And that's something that we have to acknowledge, is that real food is always going to cost more than industrial food. And by industrial food, I mean where they've just figured out how, on a really massive scale, to push out something that looks like an egg, feels like an egg, and tastes okay, right?
If the hydroponic community would be sort of making their argument for why they should be certified organic and what they bring to the table, what would they be saying, right? Not saying that you agree with this, but what would they say? Steelman their side of the argument.
I can do their side of the argument.
Yeah.
I have pretty good friends who are hydroponic growers.
Yeah.
And until recently, they rolled their eyes at organic. They're like, oh yeah, you organic guys, you with your cow horns and your, manure. And now they're all entering the market. It's like in California where suddenly marijuana became legal, and all these people who were staunchly opposed to the use of marijuana were going, well, I guess we're going to start growing it, right? The world changed.
Money.
So these people who are skilled growers in greenhouses, very heavy Dutch influence, and they knew they could make money doing it conventionally, but they could make even more money if they could sell it as organic. Much better market, much higher price. So they figured out how to process some soy, hydrolyzed soy protein and things like that, and feed the plants still in the same bags of shredded coconut husks that they were using when they were using just chemicals. Now they're using natural fertilizers that are unnatural. So what would I say if I was them in order to justify it? I would say, well, I think that we have higher levels of NPK than people in the soil.
What's NPK?
Nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus.
Mm-hmm.
And because they know exactly how to dial that stuff in, I asked one of them when he said he tested better, I said, well, have you tested the other 100,000 elements, compounds that would be in food? And no, he smiled and said, of course we haven't. And we don't know what it should be, and we don't know how to add it. One person said, if you added everything that there was in soil to a hydroponic solution, you'd end up with soil, right? It's complicated.
So going back to their side of the argument.
Okay, back to their side of the argument.
Right.
What they would say, and what they have said, and they put it out, is everyone deserves organic. And what they mean by that is we can do it cheaper. And if we do cheap food, then more people can afford it. And doesn't everyone deserve to be able to eat organic? And I would say, yes, everyone does deserve to eat organic, except that's not organic. So the problem there is a little bit more social than horticultural, which is that some people can't afford to eat good food because they don't earn enough money at their work, because their pay essentially hasn't gone up in 30 years. So maybe we need to make it that people get paid a little bit more, and then they can afford to buy good food, and then they could afford to buy real organic.
What is the government's role as the chaperone of USDA organic when it comes to maintaining the integrity and getting consumers ultimately what they think that they're buying?
What's their responsibility?
Yeah, what's their responsibility, and what have they done a good job in? And what have they done a not great job in?
Okay.
As is related to the things and the topics that we're bringing up in this conversation. Let's start with what they've done a good job in.
I'm trying.
Right?
I'm trying.
Because you mentioned that even getting this act passed in the 1990s
Yes,
was pretty amazing.
it was.
Now-
USDA hated this act, by the way. They did not want to create a national organic program. They hated organic, honestly. They did. The USDA is also known as the United States Department of Agribusiness. And their role is really to promote the development of an industry. And that industry is about chemicals, and it's about equipment. It's about Bayer, Monsanto, and John Deere. That's what the USDA's primary mission is. So what they've done that's good is they've made it that food is cheap. There have been tremendous costs to all of us in order to accomplish that. But they have made it that you can go to the store, although it doesn't feel cheap, but it's relatively cheap, and it's a lower percentage of the average person's income than in other countries. So that's what they've done. and they're proud of that. I think that they're actually proud of having gotten rid of a lot of people on the land who are farmers, and they're now living in cities. And they would claim that these farms are now more efficient. I would say that they're now simpler, which makes them more brittle and fragile and more prone to serious disruption if things go wrong. But that's a whole other conversation, right? But that's what they've done. And okay, we can celebrate that people can now afford calories in this country. They can afford to go and get food. Interestingly, a lot of people, including a lot of low-income people, go to fast food restaurants to get their calories to eat, as opposed to the store. We saw what an upheaval it was during COVID when suddenly all those restaurants were shut down as an option. And then you went to the store and there wasn't enough food on the shelves, right? There wasn't enough toilet paper on the shelves. Like, how is that possible? Did we suddenly stop making toilet paper? No, we didn't stop making it. But the distribution channel wasn't set up to have 2 rolls of toilet paper and a cell wrap on a shelf. It was set up to have a case of it delivered to a McDonald's or a Burger King. So the same is true for food and milk. Instead of coming in a jug, it came in a giant squeeze bag. Yeah. Okay. So can I talk about what they haven't done now? Or
Yeah. Please.
That is an amazing achievement, but there was so much collateral damage to pulling off that affordable food, and tremendous damage to the farm community, tremendous damage to the soil, tremendous damage to the water. You can't drink the water in Iowa. And if you have the misfortune to be down around New Orleans, you're in Cancer Alley. Cancer Alley, everyone there has a really elevated rate of cancer. That's from agriculture in Iowa. That's the runoff of all of that way of farming. Plus the soil in Iowa, there's getting to be less of it all the time. And it's more depleted of organic matter, so it's more fragile. And at some point, it stops working. It doesn't hold water. So you either get too much water or not enough water. The hydrological cycle gets changed. California, oh my God, it's getting scary out here. I got a number of friends who had to flee fires from their farms. They had to abandon them and hope that, they didn't burn down. And some of them did burn down. And that's because of the hydrological cycle. And that does have something to do with how we're farming, how we're using water. The way we're farming, more of that chemical nitrogen, less of that organic matter. That organic matter holds a lot of water. It holds it and it gives it back. But if there's nothing to hold it, the water runs off into the river, into the ocean, and it's not there to rain down again. So these things really impact the world. And nutrition, very important. What happens if you eat bad food? You get sick. You get sick much easier. We know that. And we all pay for that. Everybody, the society pays for it. Of course, the individuals are severely punished by the choices that they've been encouraged over and over to make. Bad choices. Another bag of Doritos, another can of something. All right. So those are some of the consequences of USDA not being able to keep up with, organic. If it were protected so that it was real, it would cost more, but it would open the door to there being much more high quality food available, and it would open the door to bringing that price down ultimately. It would, because we would get better and better at it. Right now, what's happening, let's say that you're a small dairy farmer. You don't have to be tiny. Let's say that you've got 300 cows, 500 cows, and you're trying to compete against a farm that has 10,000 cows in confinement. And just as with hydroponics, that confinement stuff will pay in the short run. That's why they do it. It's like, we're just going to have the cows stand there. It's a great deal like McDonald's, a giant McDonald's for cows. except that the bathrooms are all broken. And so the manure is just piling up in the lagoons, doesn't go into a nice, leach field. And the cows are eating, and they're eating food that's engineered to make them get big as fast as possible and to grow milk as quickly as possible. So they're all burned out after 2 or 3 years, right? I mean, this gets very depressing after a while, right? But that's what it is, and that has terrible consequences. And one of the consequences is that 508 cow dairy farm can't survive because the price of milk dropped below what their cost of production is, because it's very efficient, cost effective to do it the other way if you're not paying for water quality, air quality, health care.
Hey YouTube, if you enjoyed what you just saw, keep watching for more great content on how to improve your brain and your life. Can you give us an example in the last couple years in your life of how maybe something in your diet had changed based on your own response, that you thought it was working for you and you might have modified it? Give us an example from the last couple of years, your last sort of big area in your health where you were going down one path and then you tweaked it slightly.